Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Levinka, and I'm the event director at the bookstore, and I'm thrilled today to be collaborating again with our friends at NYRB to welcome Rachel Eisendrath for the release of her brilliant new book, A Gallery of Clouds, in conversation with Hisham Matar. While the pandemic has taken a toll across all of our lives, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have become bright spots in our days, and I want to give a huge thanks to our guests for joining us tonight. So to some housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button here at the bottom of the screen to submit them, and we will try to get through as many of those as we can at the end of the program. There's also a chat button here through which I'll be posting a link to purchase tonight's book, very important. A caveat for tonight's event and for all virtual events, we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We will try to solve them quickly. And finally, we've scheduled a whole host of late spring's programming heading into the summer for you. So head over to our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I do want to point out, next Thursday, our NYRB Classic series is back to welcome Mark Lilla and Colm Toybin for a discussion of Thomas Mann's Reflections of a Non-Political Man. That program is taking registrations on our website now. And last but not least, we've enabled live auto-transcribed closed captioning for the evening. So if your Zoom is updated, you can enable that from the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. So now a little about tonight's guest, and we will get started. Rachel Eisendrath is a critic and scholar who specializes in English Renaissance poetry, the author of Poetry in a World of Things, winner of the 2019 Elizabeth Dietz Award. She is the associate professor of English and director of the Medieval and Renaissance Studies program at Barnard College in New York City. And Hisham Matar is the author of 2 novels, In the Country of Men and Anatomy of a Disappearance, and 2 memoirs, The Return and A Month in Siena. He is the recipient of several international awards, including a Pulitzer Prize. His work has been translated into more than 30 languages. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and a professor at Barnard College and Columbia University. So I'm turning the stage over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. I'm very glad to be here with Hisham. And just before we get started, there's just a few people I want to thank. I want to thank the wonderful people at NYRB, particularly Sarah Kramer and Elena Taylor and Amanda Gersten and Nick During and Edwin Frank and Jeffrey Yang. And I want to thank Community Bookstore and my colleagues and students and former students who are here. I know that Aidan Schad is here, Sharon Matthew, Claire Adler, Alex Gluckman, JD Stillwell. Hello, my friends. My mother is here. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to begin by reading 3 sections of the book, the preface of the book, and 2 sections from the middle of the book. And I'll say a few words between each section. The reading will take less than 20 minutes, and then Hisham and I will talk. We'll take questions if there's time at the end from the Q&A. I should say that there are a lot of pictures in this book, and for this evening's reading, I was considering making a PowerPoint presentation, but decided against it. I hate PowerPoint, and I feel that the book might not want to align either with power or necessarily with having a point. So what I'm going to do instead is just hold up the book when there's a picture and just show the picture, and I'm hoping that will be more intimate and more in the spirit of the book. So I'm going to start with the preface. New York City, April 2021. I died and then found myself walking across a large green field. You might think heaven would be overflowing with rare flowers and exotic birds, but this meadow was just plain city grass mixed with dandelions. Some taller weeds grew along the periphery where the mower hadn't been able to reach. A few sparrows and pigeons, perhaps slightly fatter and sleeker than those to which I was accustomed, hopped about here and there. Some trees. The meadow might almost have been in Central Park. Soon I could see in the distance a small group of people who were sitting in wicker long chairs beneath a cluster of large oaks. A woman was talking and a few men were listening, leaning back in postures of attentive ease. One of them had his fingers interlaced behind his head, his legs crossed. Something about the position of their heads indicated their intelligence. I found, to my surprise, that I wasn't at all scared or shy as I approached them. I merely wanted to join their conversation. The only desirable kind of heaven, I remembered reading somewhere, is one in which you can contemplate this life, and these people seem to be actively discussing this life. So here's the first picture. Now I was standing before them. The light was playing on the pattern of the woman's dress, and my eyes could not at first sort out what was light and what was her dress. She paused in her talk and looked at me. I thought, oh, thank God, there are gay women in heaven. I did not even feel daunted that she was Virginia Woolf. The men curious who had drawn this glance from their friend turned then to look at me. But already Virginia Woolf's glance was making me bold. Already I was growing older, climbing up through the ages of myself, so that as she watched me, I slowly regained the age I actually was, which was close to her age. But it was as if I had drawn those earlier ages up with me, and so was now all the ages of myself at the same time. Improbably, without preamble or warning, I found myself telling a rabbinic story about a man who dies and dreams that he finds God. God is sitting at the far end of a room where he is reading the Torah by candlelight. What's wonderful about the story, I informed Virginia Woolf, is that God is studying the pages of his own life. Wouldn't he already know everything that was in that book? Virginia Woolf glanced delightedly at her friends and said to me, but what is in that folder? Have you brought me a gift? I realized then that I was carrying my manuscript under my arm and promptly held it out to her. This was the moment, surely, to introduce my book. Her eyes were focused on me. Her eyes, were two theater goers that had settled deeply into their plush seats and were now looking expectantly at my face. But what should I say? In the tension of that moment, two possible approaches arose in my mind, one academic, the other personal. One, academic. It is an analogy so common that it is hard to recognize as an analogy that a work of literature is like a subjectivity. Both operate largely in a verbal medium. A book exists in words. I think in words. Moreover, a book is like a subjectivity in that it can or can seem to take in observations about the world, perceive itself, double back on itself, reevaluate itself, be subject to varying interpretations, refuse to pin itself down. Collections of lyric poetry in particular often explicitly claim to locate the reader within the mind of the author. The structure of a book can, therefore, offer a kind of implicit theory of subjectivity. Some of the most famous collections of lyric poems, like Petrarch's Consigliere, are written in a form that is fragmented. Petrarch first called the collection Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta, fragments of vernacular things, and the first poem describes itself as rime sparse, scattered rhymes. These articulations might suggest a theory of mind, that there was once something whole that has been disrupted, dispersed, a paradise lost, a childhood lost, an intimacy with God lost, a time before desire struck, separating the world into subjects and wanted objects also lost. So what kind of mind is my book? Although this book, like a collection of lyric poems, despite being prose, is written in pieces in a non-narrative mode, it is not written in fragments, shards, or scattered rhymes. No unity has been lost because there never was any unity. That is why this is a book of clouds. Clouds are ephemeral moments of light and color that stay still only as long as you look at them, but then, as soon as your mind wanders, change into something else. 2, personal. It is said, rightly, that books can save your life. Surely they can do so in many ways. In as many ways, maybe, as there are readers, as there are hours, as there are apartments, as there are chairs, as there are lamps, as there are cups of coffee, as there are books. In my case, ever since I could remember, I had been inexplicably anxious. given even to a kind of experience of non-being, as though that were even possible. There must have been reasons for why, from an early age, I was beset with fear and with the sensation that the world, or even I myself, was not entirely solid. It may have been that my father had left us, unsettling my first sense of things, or that my mother then had no one and had despaired of her ability to support us, or perhaps there had once been a certain unspeakable finger that had known me before, as Shakespeare's Adonis says, I had known myself. Who's to say? But surely even the basic arrangements of existence, the universal rules under which we all live, the inevitability of death to begin, are so strange that no further reason is needed for anyone to feel perplexed and unsolid. Never mind, for now, all the other disasters that can rack a human on her journey from one shore to the other. For me, the solution to this perplexity, or since no solution is really possible, the orientation towards psychic survival, or even toward joy, came in the most unlikely way possible. It was, incredibly, through reading that I was able to find a place for my consciousness. Incredibly, because we have been trained to think that intellectual life and well-being are two separable things. This place for my consciousness was a kind of Arcadia that was necessarily both a freedom from the pressures of a largely unsparing reality and a reflection on those pressures, a way of inhabiting at the same time both myself, whatever that is, and also another person, whatever that is, a way of drawing in history, whatever that is, a way of thinking in a mode of sufficient complexity and suppleness that my mind felt real and also could whir along with a certain lightness in an as-if mode that is the single ground rule of fiction. If fiction is anything, claims Sir Philip Sidney, about whom we have much to discuss, it must be that fiction is that which is so and not so at the same time. In his words, it is that which never lieth because it never claims to tell the truth. In this unlikely way, I became a reader, one who read and read and read and still reads, and eventually became a professor of Renaissance poetry, which is what I am now. The clouds in my Arcadia, the one I found and the one I made, hold light and color. They take on the forms of other things. A cat, the sea, my grandmother, the gesture of a teacher I loved, a friend, a girlfriend, a ship at sail, my mother. These clouds stay still only as long as I look at them, and then they change. But I did not say any of those words to Virginia Woolf. Instead, just as I opened my mouth to speak, she smiled at me with her eyes. Truly, there should be a separate grammar, a grammar of the hypothetical, for all the questions and answers that can be exchanged or might be exchanged at such a moment when everything seems to pause in the interchange of a significant glance. When first your eyed, as Shakespeare says in Sonnet 104, where the eyes and eyes bounce back and forth against each other. Suddenly, standing before Virginia Woolf, holding out my manuscript, I found that the present moment included a seemingly infinite number of possible presents and possible futures, all of which could happen and also most likely wouldn't happen. Each movement of her eyes made my eyes move, which made her eyes move, and so on. The possibilities seemed for a moment endless. I was looking into a new world, her eyes, moist globes, suspended in space like planets, but with that slight quiver and charge and receptivity and assertiveness that belong to what's living. But then the moment had passed. She had taken hold of my manuscript and she was looking down at it and opening it, and soon she began to read. So the book then weaves together a number of different themes in sections that range in size from a few pages to just a sentence. And the book takes as its center of its orbit the experience of reading one particular book, which is Sir Philip Sidney's 16th-century pastoral romance, the Arcadia. And I take up this rather unlikely book, partly because of the figure of Arcadia, that this idea of Arcadia of a world where shepherds recite poetry, this kind of idyllic, utopic world, serves as a kind of figure for the many ways in which literature is, offers a kind of dream space, a kind of world that seems apart from this one and also embedded in this one, that it both offers a kind of escape and also from actuality, and also kind of confrontation with actuality. And just that there's a world that's shaped, as imaginative experience is, by historical material reality and by personal reality, by the idiosyncrasies of our own life histories. So the Gallery of Clouds is a kind of meditation on these kind of paradoxes of reading experience. So I'm gonna just read, as I said, two more sections. They're both from the middle of the book. Okay. For some of us, especially those who grew up poor or middle class, or in some ways one and in some ways the other, or who lived in inner cities, or perhaps rural areas, or who grew up in America, or let's say overseas, or maybe who were just born in the 20th or 21st century, reading or any other form of intellectual life was a covert operation, a secret act that we did not admit to in public. For me, in public might mean on the low wall in front of our apartment building in Washington, D.C., or in the neighborhood park, or at the local laundromat. In these places, we had to stay alert, ready to outmaneuver our opponents, which is to say, all people other than ourselves. Sometimes verbal finesse did the trick, but at other times, more extreme measures were required. For example, my best friend taught me the principle of sudden escalation. If you find yourself in a situation where you are the weaker party or are outnumbered, and it is clear that you're about to be beaten up or raped or both, you must act quickly. In general, pleading does not work, for that only reassures your opponent that you are indeed the chicken shit that you appear to be. Rather, against all expectations to the contrary, it is incumbent upon you to drastically heighten the violence anticipated in the encounter, and to do so suddenly and without any hesitation. The logic is simple. Your apparent irrationality will establish a new ground of power. Look at his eyes. That boy is totally crazy, said one of the young men who had only begun to warm to the task of beating up my best friend, when, without warning, this friend, a skinny, somewhat effeminate-looking boy of great courage, had spun around, screeching like a feral animal, with a broken bottle gripped in his hand. Even squirrels, remember, are scary when they are crazed. In response to such situations, we might pose the following question: how do the pressures of the present shape the contours of our inner life? The need to maintain a state of readiness for apparent insanity, or for lying, or irony, or flirtation, or intimidation, or for playing the fool, and playing the fool so long and so well that we may convince even ourselves that we are a fool, keeps us out of our dream worlds, but also perhaps creates the space for them, even when our only awareness of such worlds is of where we are forbidden to go. What would a literary criticism look like that could somehow take cognizance of such conditions of mental life? So I'm gonna read just one more section. But just before I do, I wanted to say that I worked on this book in various forms for a long time. My first attempts began about 20 years ago, and then I gave up on the project. And when I eventually found my way back onto it and was able to work on it in an intense and directed way, it's right, that happened right after I met Hisham. So it's a special pleasure to be with him here tonight, because this was close to 10 years ago, and I'd given up on the book. And I remember explaining to him that I wasn't that I wasn't actually a writer, but I was a reader, and that I wasn't even finding the time to do the kind of reading that I wanted to do, which was a kind of aimless reading. And it was just a time when I had a lot of tasks. And the next day, I was in my office, and there was a knock on the door, and it was Hisham, and he was carrying an hourglass, a real hourglass with glass and sand, and he explained to me that that my assignment was that I had to spend an hour, no matter how busy I thought I was, reading in an aimless way, and that's truly when I gave myself over to reading again with some freedom, and from that to finding my way actually back into the writing or rewriting of this book. So because reading really lies at the heart of this book, I'm going to end my reading aloud this evening with a very brief section also from the center of the book. And it's a section that returns to the experience of reading. And this section includes at the end a few lines from a poem of Saskia Hamilton's. Lamps at night are lighthouses of the imagination. Imagination goes and returns to them, gauges its distance on the sea of its own protean worlds by their peaceful and steady light. Or maybe with their softly glowing golden shades, they are the planets of the domestic nighttime thought world, without needs of their own, not even the need to fall as things on planets feel. They hover in space, quietly communicating to the mental seafarer their promise that something out there will remain unchanged. They are the kindly gaze that searches your eyes for the pain it might take on itself. The silence of the desk lamp is so profound that all sounds, except maybe the leaf-like rustling of a turning page or the animal scratching of the pen's nib, stay at a distance, hovering at the periphery of the luminous circle. A clink of a dish in the other room, a shuffle of a known pair of slippers, a faucet on, then off, a heating pipe. These sounds only increase the silence around the lamp. Around the lamp, the air becomes more still, electrons settle down, and nuclei become like pillows. What is this mysterious harmony that a lamp has with a book? It is as if the lamp knew and shared in the silence that lies at the heart of the book, beneath all the eager little words. I slept before a wall of books, and they calmed everything in the room, even their contents. Saskia Hamilton. Such lines are written in lamplight. Thank you.
Rachel, that was wonderful. It was wonderful to hear you read, and I was very touched by what you said. And you are definitely a writer. You're not only a writer, you're a wonderful writer. And this book is such a gift to us all. So thank you for writing it, and congratulations on it. It's a book that I feel very close to, because I've read it several times, and with some time between each time, and it feels a bit. It's good that you started with the preface, because the book is a bit like that. It's sort of a dream where it's like one of those dreams when you're slightly conscious of the fact that you're having a dream. So and all the parts are moving in such a way that seems so unlikely, yet so natural. And I suppose I wanted to start to talk to you about that, about the way the book sounds, the way its tone is laid out. I found it very intriguing, its prose, because it is it makes a lot of room for me and for the reader. It's just it's both formal but also very welcoming and capable of revealing, discrete facts and moments of deep intimacy. And yet there's no assumption that you're going to know it all here. So, and within this, there's a mobility, as though we have entered a hall where everything is suspended and moving in ways that aren't certain. And you do this in so many ways, but I think one of them is to do with this sense of you finding occasion for instance, to make surprising connections between, say, Virginia Woolf and Sir Philip Sidney, or Adorno and Poussin, or gestures in painting, or everyday speech, social gestures, and literary form. Like the second section, actually, you read, does that. We then see how something like what you describe with your best friend, and what that might mean in the way that we read. You also find occasion to complicate definitions, to complicate the barriers between, say, an epic and a romance, or what our assumptions might be about the nature of the elaborate, ornate style and so-called straightforward, plain speech. The most blatant but also elegant, I think, example of this is the book itself, because it's a brief book about a long book, or about a long way of being, right? About reading beside the sea languidly, whilst still being very much ensconced in a volatile, uncertain world that is not solid, as you say. And you link all of this to time, and you do it with a sleight of hand in the whole book. And of course, your prose, the tone, is deeply invested in time. And in one way, has its own philosophy about time, about what a book can make of time, how it can occupy it, manage it, and possibly even change it. So in all of this, I read, in part, the book as a kind of invitation or advocacy even for the availability of literature, or for a certain way of reading, a certain kind of reading. And I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more about this, and about this, the tone of the book, and how it happened, how you created it.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, tone in literature is a very hard thing to talk about, and there's something about tone that I think resists theorization and resists generalization, right? And literary criticism hasn't proven to be very adept at talking about tone, right? That it gets klutzy around tone, and yet I think we all feel that tone makes all the difference in the world, right? There's it's I mean, in that way, it's like touch or gesture and sculpture. And Henry Moore has a really lovely essay on Giovanni Pisano's, the 13th century sculptor, has these sculpture that has those incredible figures with their heads that are thrust out at 45-degree angles from their body, with this kind of urgency of communication. And he's talking about the sort of importance of that kind of beseeching, urgent gesture of these figures. And and Moore says something like, we, under the name of a hand on someone's shoulder, hand on someone's shoulder can be, I'm going to get what Henry Moore says a little bit wrong, but a hand on someone's shoulder can be intimate, it can be comforting, it can be aggressive, it can be invasive, right? It can be kind, it can be cruel. That all depends on the quality of that touch, right? And yet it's it's all a hand on the shoulder. And tone has some of that, right? You know, whether something is intimate or ironic or confessional, right? And, you know, I think for me in literature, you know, tone is the most interesting when it's the hardest to talk about, because, you know, there's more than one thing happening at the same time, or there are quick pivots in tone, right? That give one a sense of a living being, you know, a living voice, a voice that's hearing itself talk, right? That is both perhaps guileless and also self-aware. You know, in the preface section that I read, you know, I was describing the experience of kind of climbing up through the ages of myself, sort of trying to attain my current age, in response to the kind of demand of Virginia Woolf's gaze. And, you know, I think there's that, you know, an aspiration to have a kind of layered effect, you know, where one is inhabiting kind of more than one kind of awareness, right? Because that's what we do, you know, where I'm modulating myself as I'm fantasizing how you're reacting, or, you know, as I hear myself, you know, I'm adjusting, right? And I'm a reader to my own writing. I'm a listener to my own voice, right? You know, and I mean, some of my favorite writers, you know, really do that incredibly well. Shakespeare does that amazingly, where there'll just be these very tight pivots, where a character will switch his or her mode of inhabiting him or herself, so that just when we think we understand, oh, it's a type, you know, that person's almost seems to be responding to our perception that he or she is just a type, right? And, you know, shocks us back into a kind of sense of this being a consciousness.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful, and I'm glad you spoke about it in terms of touch, because also there's something about the surface of it, and these, not only in the literal sense, these section breaks that you provide, some of which, as you said, some of these sections are just one sentence and a very short sentence, and sometimes there are a few pages, but also in the way the sentences themselves work, that you feel that there's a space that's being opened up. Maybe there are cracks or places where you could reside, in the sense, but also cracks in the sense that there's places where light is coming in. And I think that's a very interesting thing to do, because once a book gets to a certain length, it becomes harder to manage that. The paradox is, I always feel. But you also, I mean, what you write about, and the book itself seems to be thinking about the book as an object, as being immeasurable, or that you describe at some point it glowing in the distance, like a book in the sense, you know, coming at us, or we're coming to it. And there's that subtle and effective symmetry that you create of literally the ink drying, of Sir Philip Sidney writing his pages and whisking them off quickly to his sister before the ink dries, and then the image of your teacher writing you from the Swiss Alps, also with a kind of wetness of the ink, you know. That, in other words, that books are, of course, all the things that we know them to be, but there's something slightly mysterious in the sense that they're knowing and revealing objects that are a realization, a theory of mind, as you put it. Can you perhaps say a little bit more about this?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Gallery of Clouds, I think, is, I mean, one of the paradoxes I think it's interested in is, you know, the way in which books are and are not material objects, right? And it's one of the games it's playing is with the materiality of a book. And you know, and I think that's part of the kind of investigation of, or one way of thinking about it, it's part of the investigation that, you know, the paths by which we come to books matter, right? The life we're embedded in matters, you know, in terms of how we receive the book, you know, what we bring to it. And, you know, and I mean, as you know, it's something I think about in teaching, you know, of that, you know, what it means to bring a book to somebody else, to, you know, ask a student to read a book that you've chosen, you know, that ideally there's something intimate in that, you know, in that handing over, you know, where there's that, in that path matters. If somebody we hate gives us a book, you know, it's very unlikely we're going to, you know, have any receptivity to that book, you know, so that the specificity of that path matters. And then the book as an object in the world, I mean, that also sort of makes its own mysterious kind of journey, is, you know, that creates different kinds of idiosyncratic and contingent encounters, you know, is also how things evolve, you know, how one's inner world evolves, right? You know, is on some of those kind of surprising paths. And, you know, one of I mean, the book begins with aspects of how Sidney wrote his book, worked on it partly at his sister's estate, and the specificity of their relationship, you know, and then my writing of the book also evolves out of the fact that when I ordered this edition of Sidney, of Fouillera's early edition, a reprint of it, of the prose works of Philip Sidney, that the person that I ordered it from, you know, just an online bookseller, you know, warehouse kind of thing, the seller sent me an extra volume, that it's a several volume set, and he just included the extra volume because he said, you know, these two books had sat side by side on his shelf for many years, and he was loath to separate these two books, so he just sort of gave them to me. And you know, and it was just from this anonymous person. And then he ends this little note that, you know, he found that I found inside this book, saying, you know, that they've been sitting on his shelf for many years, ever since he left graduate school. And then he says, besides, I left the land of nymphs and shepherds long ago, you know, and, you know, so it's just this, so somebody I had never met, you know, sort of had his own history with this same physical object that now I had, right? And Virginia Woolf describes a very similar thing of imagining who owned her copy of the Arcadia before, and what journey it had made. And there's an odd way in which that kind of story of how objects move is the kind of story that's told within the Arcadia. So, you know, some of those kinds of contingencies and the odd way in which objects move in the world, you know, gives them also the quality of being romances. So that's a completely rambling answer, but I'm describing something rambling.
No, it's a wonderful answer. And actually this is the very unlikely thing that happens in the book, because you make connections between such a wide range of things that you wouldn't think could be connected, right? Personal moments, you know, unlikely events like this, readings, but also readings through a wide range of writers, paintings, buildings, and so it's both startling how you weave all of these together. It's very naturally done. It's not forced at all. But what's all the more startling about it is that once you're done, you feel, yeah, that's the way the world is. That's the most natural state of things. Like everything resonates, and is connected. I wondered, maybe it's the same for you, but when I first start thinking about a book, it's impossible for me to describe, even to myself, what it is that I'm thinking about. And then by the time I end up with the book, there's a very interesting relationship between the finished book and those early glimpses that exist almost outside of language. And there is a correspondence, but sometimes there's both a correspondence and there's a departure. And so I was wondering for you, when you first thought of this book 20 years ago, what did you think you were thinking about?
I had no idea. I had no idea. You know, there's some, I was just came across some line, is it Cicero? I'm not sure, where I think he says something like, oh, the person's a fool because he's trying to write better than he can write. And I feel like, what a ridiculous thing to say. Who isn't trying to write better than you can write, right? Like, that we're always sort of trying to, making attempts to achieve something that's alive, that's real, that contains things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to say, right? And then being readers of that book that we're writing, and then, trying again, right? That process of, trying to find a form for what otherwise doesn't have articulation, is why it takes a long time. I mean, the idea that you sort of start with the book and then write it down, and this seems ridiculous. That's not at all what happens in my
yes. No, that's definitely my experience too, that I assumed before I wrote anything that you write a book once you've figured it out, once you sort of the thing has matured in you. And I mean, you know this, but Ovid's idea about chaos isn't, to Ovid, chaos isn't a state in which nothing makes sense and things are happening chaotically in the way that we understand it. But chaos as a state of indifference. And I mention this because in the book there's a motif that books, art, are an alternative to chaos. That you say, I think, in the section that you that you read, that the basic arrangement of existence. So the basic arrangements of existence are so strange that no further reason is needed for anyone to feel perplexed and unsolid. That in reading we can find, quote, a place of our consciousness. Tell me more about that. About books as being a sort of order. Are they? What do you mean by them being an alternative to chaos?
That's a very perceptive question, Hisham. Yeah, I mean, I think that's played out, in terms of, my own sort of personal experience of reading. I also think of, the intellectual historian Hans Blumenberg. He talks about how when he's imagining the first myths, he imagines them as providing a relief from what he calls bitter earnestness, that they create a kind of a slight but necessary distance from all that can come at one, he says, from the kind of absolutism of reality. And he quotes this letter of Kafka's, where Kafka talks about, says something like that the whole pantheon of the gods was only a means by which a human, the determining forces could be kept at a distance so that human lungs could have some air. That there's some kind of there's some quality, there's a space, right? That there's some kind of distance from which thought can occur, right? I also think it's important to say that books also contain chaos, right? That they're not, and as you know well, they're not just a relief from encounter with reality, that they're a form of that encounter, and that they're imprinted everywhere with the chaos and brutality of the world, and they're imprinted, to the extent that they're complex and real books, they're imprinted. They're always imprinted with that, whether it's in a direct or an indirect way, whether they're talking about Arcadia or whether they're talking about war, and war comes into Arcadia too, even, but that there's, and particularly in dealing with 16th century European literature, it's imprinted with violence. It's imprinted with European fantasies of domination. Arcadia has a history that is not divorced from fantasies about the New World, fantasies about about dominating the New World, right? And that's a topic that I enter into via Verrazzano's report of to Francis I about what he finds in the New World, and this kind of blithe kidnapping that he attempts that he does kidnap a boy and then tries to kidnap a young woman, and that, and then he notes in the letter, we baptize the land Arcadia on account of the beauty of the trees, and it's such a shocking moment, and that kind of fantasy of Arcadia and the brutality of that is part of that tradition. It's not extricable. It's deeply in there, and it can come up, and it's so deeply in there that the complex work can put it up for critique too. Yeah. So Shakespeare and Shakespeare's Tempest, we get a fantasy of Arcadia, of a golden world, of an untouched island that these Europeans have just arrived, where they've just arrived, and Gonzalo, the king's counselor, is fantasizing about, it's this place of, sort of free from all these problems of civilization, and there's no need for laws, there's no need for this, so he has this kind of golden age Arcadian fantasy, and then he's mocked in the play, and the people, some of the other characters make cracks at him and say, but he would be king on it. So he wants a place that has no idea of rule, but he wants to be king of it, right? So that whole fantasy of domination, because it's Shakespeare, also comes up, it's expressed and it comes up for critique, so there is, that's what a complex literary work is doing, right? So yeah, I would guess I'm interested in both the way in which literature is allowing us that kind of relief from brutality, right, and chaos and violence, and then also is within that, providing an object that crystallizes some of that we can think about, right, and render even that into something that is thinkable, right?
Yeah, beautiful. I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll attempt to do the impossible, which is look through the questions and select from everybody else's questions. And thank you in advance for putting in your questions, and please feel free to add more. My last question is a very selfish question. It's a question to do with one of your readers who loves reading you and loves being in the company of your mind and the company of your prose. And if we assume for a moment that as we write books, the books that we write also have an effect on us, they author us in some way, or author our next steps, or make certain things possible, or if we assume that's correct for a moment, what is this book allowing for you next? What is it making you think about? And this is a kind of a indirect way of saying, what are you writing next, and when will it be ready? No.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have some things that I've agreed to do, small things, but I've just finished the teaching year, and yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm looking forward to just in the next few weeks is I think less actually about writing probably, and just being able to return to the space of reading, of reading in that kind of non-instrumentalizing kind of way, and
Yes.
just, really letting what emerges emerge and try to learn from it. I mean, I have some things I want to read and things I'm looking at, but they're at best, sort of mobiles right now around my head, so I don't know.
Wonderful.
Thank you, though.
So this is one of the questions that's been sent from Jay Ruiz. Excuse me if I'm mispronouncing the name. How did you land on the organizational structure of the book? I'm almost finished and have loved how it flows.
Oh, thank you. In some ways, it did evolve, actually. Like I mean, as I said, there was really a long period of really not having any sense of how this was going to work. So a lot of just trying things and working by trial and error. I think that there was some point at which once, almost like, that I felt like I knew my way, and almost like you're walking around with like a divining rod or something, and then you discover there's water or something, and then it's, you sort of have it has its own current, right? And you're learning from what you're doing, that there's a life in what you're doing. I'm not answering your question at all. But that the material itself is giving you direction, and that there's a moment in the book that talks about how there are books that grow not in the manner of a building where a concrete block is put on top of a concrete block, and goes upward, but it grows more in the manner of a plant, where any clipping of that plant can become the source of new growth. And there is a way in which once the book was actually underway, that it did evolve and grow in that way, and in that sense did imitate a kind of subjectivity that doesn't want to be resolved, doesn't want to be made into a totally knowable object, but wants to, as Tom Hune says, subjectivity wants to become more of what it already is. It doesn't want to be resolved, exactly. So it wants to be more subjectivity. So that actually is in some ways practically true. Like that is what happened with this book. Yeah. It's not how other things I've worked on have played out, but it did play out that way here.
There are several wonderful, not questions, but praise, enthusiasm for the book and for you, and thanking you for it. And then there are several other questions that I think I can group because they're pretty much about, I think, around the same theme. So for the sake of time, they are to do with what are your influences. Some mention that they have recognized or spotted or feel that you might like Sebald and Benjamin. So what are the influences? And if I may add one thing about the influences, because there's a story in the Arabian Nights about an island that has a very strong gravitational pull, and the ships that come close to it, the gravity of the island will unravel the ship by pulling out all the nails, and the ship will just. So maybe to add that image in the question of influence, whether you see influence like that or actually the opposite, that it is an energizing thing.
Usually when I find books I love, they just seem generous to me. Actually, I don't they don't pull out my nails exactly. Maybe I don't anyway, but yeah, I feel actually given to. My favorite authors. I love Proust. Proust is very important to me. Proust's understanding of time is very important to me. Borges is very important to me. A lot of the authors I talk about in the book are important to me. Montaigne is important to me. Shakespeare is very close to my heart. I'm never done. Encountering Shakespeare is it is like encountering somebody that you've known for a long time. That it's an ongoing kind of project. But I'm also constantly encountering new people. Just in the past year, I read Elsa Morante for the first time, and was amazed by her. Hisham turned me on to Nawal El-Saadawi, whom I just read a few weeks ago for the first time, and I was that affected me a lot. So I'm still hearing these voices right now. So it's endless. Thank
Wonderful. God. Yeah, thank God, exactly. Thank you, Rachel, so much. Thank you for the book. Thank you for the beautiful reading. And thanks to everyone who's there. I'm sad we can't see you, but we imagine you. And this is, I'm the last salesman on the planet. So I'm not saying go buy the book for any other reason except that it will give you great pleasure, and it would be just a beautiful gift. The book itself is a gift, and it would be a beautiful gift to yourself, but also to others. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for writing it.
Thank you, Hisham.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, so much for joining us tonight, and congratulations on the book. It really felt like it was written specifically for our bookstore, so I can't wait to get more into hands. And a reminder to everybody too, in the chat, I did post a link to purchase tonight's book. If you don't catch that right now, just head over to our bookstore webpage, communitybookstore.net, and we'll have copies. Otherwise, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. This was a lot of fun. Rachel, again, congratulations. Hisham, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation and staying up late. I hope your night in London, continues apace, or go to sleep. And
It's just starting.
Yeah, good. Otherwise, everybody get vaxxed, stay safe, and we'll all be together soon.
Thank you all so much.
Good night.